All right, hello everybody. You may remember that when I talked about the King in Yellow, I mentioned that one of the things I found about Chambers was that one of his influences was Ambrose Bierce. Now, if you were in American public schools and you had an American literature course, you probably read a short story by Ambrose Bierce, a very good short story. It's called like a happening at Owl Creek Bridge or Owl Creek Ridge or something like that. Something along those lines. I'll put a link in the description. But that was written by Ambrose Bierce, and it's heralded as a very good, an excellent short story. And that's where I read my first bit and only bit up until recently of Ambrose Bierce. Well, what I can say is that I went hunting around for bits of Ambrose Bierce's writings recently, and one of the things I found was there was a big collection that was published in or starting in and slightly after 1909, which was like a 12-volume collection of Ambrose Bierce's writings. And so I found the first volume of that, and the first thing in that is I guess I would call it like a long novella or something like that. It is called Ashes of the Beacon, and it is advertised as a historical monograph written in 4930. This is a really interesting piece. I haven't read any Ambrose Bierce since high school, so I didn't really know what to expect. All I know is that Robert Chambers said he was a big influence and a really good writer. And this particular piece is actually really interesting to read. It is what it proclaims to be. It's kind of like a science fiction or speculative fiction piece that Bierce wrote, kind of predicting the destruction of America and the civilized world and what things might look like in 4930. It's not heavy on like the technological aspect of things. It's more like a political or historical study. And what you get from it is, number one, that Bierce is a very solid writer. Not only does he have a good sense of what to put in, he also has a good sense of how to keep things relatively short. This thing, of course, could have gone on for another 100 pages, but Bierce kept it short at around 50, 60, 70, 80, something like that. That said, it is a fairly lengthy piece. It's hard to tell how much of it is satirical and how much of it is Bierce being cantankerous. It's very scornful of democracy or republican or representative government. It's also scornful of like the rule of the majority, and yet at the same time, it also notes it also is opposed to like monarchy and things like that. It's one of those things where he kind of there's that old Churchill quote, right? It's the worst system except all the other ones we know of. There's a hint of that here, which puts Ambrose Bierce writing this in the early 1900s, 40 years ahead of Churchill's observation, where, by 4930, people have figured out something even better. That better thing is not clearly described in this monograph because, well, it's probable that Bierce didn't want to write something and have it get taken down immediately. He kind of talks about various things, and some of it sounds very communistic, and some of it sounds very opposed to that as well. He's all over the place, and it's very hard to tell the difference between where Bierce is being satirical, where Bierce is being serious, and where Bierce is kind of exaggerating for the sake of effect. For instance, he calls democracy rule by, quote, the ignorant, restless, and reckless, end quote. And he talks about how 1995 was the end of everything, where American society collapsed, and that there was this mass deterioration starting in 1920 and going through 1995. Another interesting part of this is that you get a significant amount of unreliable narrator bits here, because this future historian from 4930 gets a whole lot of things wrong as well. And so now you're not even sure, whether Bierce is satirizing the past or, thinking about the future and satirizing that, or deliberately getting things wrong so that the conclusion of the narrator is also incorrect. It's a work that is open to a lot of different interpretations, which makes me think which made me really enjoy and find it interesting. He makes some points that are actually kind of maybe meaningful. He talks about how there was this tendency for people that he calls anarchists to attack, power because it was power and not because it was power wielded badly, right? He talks about how the anarchists were attacking conspicuously benign or beneficial leaders rather than the actual bad guys, rather than the actual tyrants. He talks about these massive slaughters in cities, these massacres. He talks about jury trials and how, the narrator says that the original conception of jury duty, or jury trials, was that the jury were people who were knowledgeable about the situation, as opposed to what it became, where the jurors are people who are of below average intelligence and don't know anything about the situation. And therefore, pretending that these people are likely to give the best answer is kind of silly. He talks about how judges naturally are picked from the group of people that are advocating for the criminals, and therefore they have their own, baked in assumptions that end up, messing things up even more so when they become judges. He has this long talk about women and how women, because they didn't have the vote, were allowed to murder men with impunity. There's a lot of stuff about the hypothetical situation of women between 1920 and 1995 and onward, which is actually kind of it's weird and imaginative and fun, while also being dark and satirical, and it's really cool stuff. He talks about how there's he has discourses on protectionism and labor unionism, where he talks about how at some point there was a barbers guild that got a hold of enough congressmen that they could make it illegal to have a beard. He talks about how there are these wealthy manufacturers, owners of businesses, who would give charity to random people, but the lowest possible wages to their workers. And then he talked about how that further evolved in the existence of labor unions, and then labor unions became their own tyrannical force. There's two quotes that I think are kind of fun. He has this long discussion of the evils of insurance. And on page 54 of the issue, or the edition that I was looking at, he has this extended quote. Quote, "In the year 1906, San Francisco was totally destroyed by fire. The conflagration was caused by the friction of a pig scratching itself against an angle of a wooden building. More than 100,000 persons perished, and the loss of property is estimated by Cobo Dogarka at 1.5 million drusos." Aside, in 4930, they don't know what a dollar was worth. They observed that a dollar's value changed drastically, talking about inflation. He also makes up a bunch of fictional historians from the future who look at this stuff, and then he makes up units like drusos, which are it's a measure of value, but we don't really know, reading this, what it's worth either. Continuing the quote, "On more than 2/3 of this enormous sum, the insurance companies had laid bets, and the greater part of it they refused to pay. In justification, they pointed out that the deed performed by the pig was, quote, an act of God, end quote, who, in the analogous instance of the express companies, had been specifically forbidden to take any action affecting the interests of parties to a contract or the result of an agreed undertaking." Setting aside again, this is actually a reference to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, where it was rumored, and then later debunked, that it was caused by a cow kicking over a lamp. It's one of those things where it was supposedly, what I read about it is that there was a group of journalists who said, yeah, we made up the cow kicking over the lamp thing because it made it more exciting for the readers. It's worth also noting that, according to what I read, in the Great Chicago Fire, the immediate deaths due to the fire was something like 300 persons, and not 100,000 as Bierce talks about. But now to finish up this quote, he says, quote, "In that case also, the insurance companies had successfully denied their liability on the ground that the cow, manifestly incited by some supernatural power, had unlawfully influenced the result of a wager to which she was not a party. The company's defendant had contended that the recourse of the property owners was against not them, but the owner of the cow." And that, of course, is the reference to the Great Chicago Fire. one other little quote that I wanted to point out that kind of underlines Bierce's satirical wit is from page 78. Quote, Strayman says that in his time 2 millions of unoffending workmen in the various industries were once discharged without warning and promptly arrested as vagrants and deprived of their ears because a sulking canal boatman had kicked his captain's dog into the water. And the dog was a retriever. So, yeah, I am going to continue reading Ambrose Bierce when I have some free time, but I just thought that it'd be nice to kind of go through this Ashes of the Beacon, give you guys a link to where you can read it yourselves for free, and more Ambrose Bierce if you're interested. And yeah, this is good writing. It's fun. It's satirical. It's imaginative. It's weird. And so if you like, the King in Yellow, if you like, I wouldn't say that this is cosmic horror-y, but it's definitely more grounded than that. But at the same time, you can see how this weird fiction evolved into, what Weird Tales called Gooseflesh stories, and, later became the magazine where, Lovecraft wrote a bunch of frightening stories about things outside of our normal understanding. And a historical monograph written in 4930 is definitely something outside of our understanding. Anyway, I'll leave you with that for today. Go check this book out. It is fun. And of course, there are apparently 12 volumes of it, of which I only so far have found 8 on archive. But I'll put a link in the description to the first volume of this set. And also I've made a list where I put in volumes, I think, 1 through 8 so far. And that way, if you want to keep reading, you can look at that list and look at volumes 2 through 8 as well. Anyway, that's what I've got for today. Hopefully you find this interesting. I am continuing to look through, I think I'm going to do a reading of a story called, oh goodness, what's it called? The Tomb? The Grave? There was a story that I found in an early pulp magazine that I thought was kind of a fun little early ghost story. And so I'll probably do a reading of that this week if I can get around to it. And until then, have a good week, and I will see you next time.